Right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for joining us on this beautiful Chamber of Commerce sunny afternoon. We appreciate your patience and hanging in there with us as the senator had a meeting over at the Capitol and allowed him some time to get back. And we'll hold for just 1 minute before we turn it over to the senator as we allow participants from the waiting room to enter in. But we are very honored to have Senator Jerry Moran with us this afternoon. As you all know, he represents the Johnson County area in Shawnee, and he is going to be doing a few of these talks with local chambers, and we were delighted to find out that we were the first chamber that Senator Moran has selected to talk to our businesses about their effects, how they're dealing with COVID-19, and as they're ready to kind of re-enter those challenges that they're facing. So this is definitely meant to be a question and answer session. So in the chat feature at the bottom or at the Q&A feature at the bottom, please go ahead and enter your questions, and we will work to monitor those throughout. But Senator Moran is joining us today from his office in Washington, D.C. Senator Moran is on the Commerce, Science, Banking, and Appropriations Committee. He also chairs our Veterans Affairs Committee. So he's been representing us since 2010 and has definitely been a great advocate of our area of businesses and of our communities in general. So we are very thrilled and honored to have you with us today, Senator Moran. And I thought I would let you just maybe update our businesses and members on, what is going on out there in DC. And then I've got a few questions that people have already sent to me, and we'll allow others to kind of put some in the Q&A, and we'll just have a little conversation.
That's great, Ann. Thank you very much, and thanks to your chamber members for joining us. I'm delighted to spend some time with you. We did have a vote. I apologize for the false start. We thought we could be here at 5. It turned out we had a vote scheduled, and it's slow to get the vote going, and we vote longer because not that many senators can come on the Senate floor at the same time. So thank you for letting me delay the start until 5:10, and I'm appreciative of, again, the chance to have a conversation with you. And you said this is the first in a series. We've not had another one of these in Johnson County, so Shawnee is the first. I will see how it goes and see if I want to do any more. So if your members are easy to deal with and we have some kind of level of answers, I'll feel good about this. But I'm smiling when I say that. I hope that we can provide information. Alex Richard is on the call. He's my state director. He's my local guy at Johnson County and all of Kansas. And he may be called on by me on a difficult question. Connor McGrath is with us as well. Connor has been one of our 2 staffers most involved in trying to make the PPP program work for Kansans and for our lenders, our banks, our credit unions, and most importantly to the businesses who are borrowing money in order to keep their businesses going and their employees on the payroll. So we've been through, this is what I call 3.5 phases of legislative effort in Washington, D.C. First of all, I'd apologize for the circumstance that we all find ourselves in. And we have a lot of work to do to try to make certain that we recover. In my view, recovery means that people need to be healthy, need to know that they're healthy, while all of us are anxious for a return to something of near normal. I think the way that we get there is by making certain that we have the necessary tools in place to protect people from the virus, to make sure that if it's contracted, that we have the necessary healthcare delivery system to care for people, and to make certain that people know that it's okay to go back out to work. If President Trump announced tomorrow that everybody should leave their homes and go back to work, or if Governor Kelly changes her phased-in plan, there are going to be a lot of people who jump at the chance to do the most that they can do, to do everything, to get out and about. But I also know that there's people who are still concerned about their well-being, want a greater sense of satisfaction than an elected official telling them it's okay to be out and about. That, in my view, means that we need testing. It means that we need broad-based testing. It's not a solution to everything in every aspect, because generally the test is going to be valid at the moment that the test is taken. But if we can isolate people who are positive as compared to isolate everyone, the economy can recover more quickly. And if we can track the disease, if we can gain more information, if we can provide greater assurance that the person you're working next to is not have the virus, they're not positive, and if we can satisfy people that if they go to work, they're not coming home and bringing a problem to their children or to their older parents. So we believe in testing. I would tell you that the real opportunity is for a vaccine. That generally is thought to be about a year away. It's been said like January or so of 2021. Earlier this week, I had the head of the NIH, Dr. Francis Collins, with me on a call to the KU Health System Board and other healthcare leaders in Kansas. And he has been given billions of your dollars, taxpayer dollars, to lead the effort to find a vaccine. And the good news I don't say this from my perspective, that the experts who were on the call with me, the doctors, physicians, the experts in medicine who deal with the virus on a daily basis, were very pleased at his positive report at how much sooner than what was anticipated that we would have a virus vaccine. And that is encouraging because that does give us the best level of comfort that we're safe and secure. I started down the path a moment ago. We've been through 3.5 phases. Congress is back in session. At least the Senate is in session for the last 3 weeks. And the House was in one day last week to pass their phase 4. But today, for example, we had a hearing. I'm a member of the Banking Committee, as Ann said, hearing with Secretary Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, and with Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. So Congress, the Senate is at work. Last week, for example, we had a hearing in the Commerce Committee on what we should have learned from COVID-19 in regard to telecommunications and access to broadband. So there are hearings ongoing, there are votes on the Senate floor, and perhaps most importantly, there's a conversation going on about what's next, what needs to be done to move us further in the well-being of people, both economically and with their health. So again, I would say, maybe to conclude my remarks, I have voted for all phases, all 3.5 phases of this legislation. In some ways, that's surprising, maybe to my constituents and maybe to me. The last time we had an economic crisis in 2008 and 9, I was one of a handful of members of Congress who voted against, quote, every bailout. I see this as different, and I see it as widespread and problems created by people through no fault of their own. And I see that if we don't address the health and well-being of people, both economically and medically, that this is a problem that's going to linger for a long time. And we need to do better in that regard than doing nothing. And in my view, there probably will be an additional phase that deals with this issue. So, Ann, let me take the conversation in whatever direction your members would like to take it.
Mute myself here first. So, one of the questions, I've got a few here, I'm just trying to make sure you didn't answer any of them in your remarks already. Who else, I mean, how do we get this next phase? And who do you see that are the champions there to help pull us through this financial disaster in the future? I mean, how do we as businesses help support our elected officials in getting sort of this next phase passed and our voices heard on what is really needed?
This, I think, is really important. And when you say, how can we help? There's a responsibility of individuals, of business owners, of employees, of customers. And while I am one who wants to see more activity outside the home, I want to have more freedom. I would remind people that with freedom comes responsibility. And so when the question is I doubt that this was the answer you were looking for, but when people say, how can I help? It's like behave. The social distancing is important. It is critical that we keep the space between us. It's important in those circumstances where a mask is necessary to wear a mask. Those things will help us get through this as quickly as we can. In addition to that, I mean, the business community of Shawnee can help me in relaying to me what is and isn't working. While I think we've had some success with some of the important programs that Congress and the President have approved, I know that there are people who are slipping through the cracks. I know that we did this work in haste and there were challenges that were created. Congress doesn't do a very good job when we are methodical. We probably do our jobs less well when we are in a rush. But timing, in my view, was so important. Every day that went by, and I experienced this in calling businessmen and women across Kansas and talking to them about what the plan might be, particularly the Paycheck Protection Program, the SBA guaranteed loan. I had a number of employers say, oh, that's so useful for me to know now, because I'm sitting here at my desk trying to figure out how many employees I can keep and which ones I'm going to lay off or furlough. And I was getting ready to do that today, or I was getting ready to do that tomorrow. So timing was important. So one of the things that the Chamber can do to be helpful to me and to my colleagues is provide us with the information of what's important to your members. And if you're a business person, tell me what's important to you as a businessman or woman. So again, personal responsibility as we open up, doing the things that make sense to protect our health and well-being and that of our employees and that of our customers. And as our customers and employees doing the same thing, and then help us better improve the response that we're providing to date.
Wonderful. Just as a side note, we've been surveying our members throughout this period of time, and we'd be happy to send that information and those survey results on, and we may even contact your staff about some of those questions that you want answers to and send out surveys to our members. So you touched on the PPP program, and those loans were to be forgiven, and that forgiveness not, my understanding. And then the IRS issued notice 2020-32 stating that if the forgiveness was not taxed, then the related business expenses could not be deducted as usual. So the understanding is that there is legislation pending to correct this. I just want to make sure that, is that the case? Is it that there is some legislation out there that will correct this, I think, unintended issue?
And that is true. What you just said is true. And I would tell you that the conversations that we had, the discussions and the debate that occurred in the Senate on the PPP program, this was not an expected outcome. So it came as a surprise to not only the business community, but to those of us who worked hard to get a PPP program in place. Connor, you want to use your expertise to bring people up to date on those developments?
Yes, sir. So our office last week actually heard from the Kansas Society of CPA on this very issue. We have flagged our concerns with the IRS and Treasury and SBA, and we've talked separately with both the Small Business Committee, the Senate Small Business Committee, and the Senate Finance Committee. It was brought to our attention recently, actually, too, that Senator Cornyn himself had actually introduced legislation that would address this issue by making sure that the full deduction of PPP-related expenses would be remain deductible, or would be deductible. So that being said, that's a bill that our staff is currently evaluating right now with our tax expert in the office to eventually bring to Senator Moran. And separately, I do know that this is an issue that's being considered with both the Small Business Committee, Finance Committee, related to updated comprehensive COVID packages as well.
So, Connor, thank you. Sometimes Kansans will say we shouldn't do a phase 4. I certainly understand the thought that we're spending lots of money, $3 trillion in phases 1, 2, 3, and 3.5. And again, as I indicated, there's a history here that would suggest I'm challenged by that thought. But there has to be another phase that takes care of the problems that we've created, as I indicated earlier, this being one of them.
So earlier today, the Shawnee Chamber Exec Committee voted to support some COVID-19 legislation that's going through Topeka next week, or actually this week, I guess, that is really liability for those businesses that that protects them so that individuals can't come back and sue them in case they feel like that maybe they were at their restaurant or their business and they got contracted COVID-19 there, unless of course there was wanton and willful denial of any of the recommended precautions. Is there anything like that on the federal level that will come through as part of this next phase, or what is that out there? And maybe I'm just not aware of that at the federal level.
And it is. I mean, lots of liability issues will be resolved at the state levels, which is a good thing. But this one is a federal concept as well, and it's one of the most politically charged issues that we will face. As we finished phase 3 and we began trying to restock the PPP program, it went through the amount of money we'd set aside, $350 billion in 2 weeks. So we had legislation just to add additional dollars so the program could continue and take care of more businesses and their employees. There was a lot of effort to do other things in that bill. One of the things that Leader McConnell, the Republican leader of the Senate, indicated is that his number one priority for whatever happened next had to include liability protections. And that, I think, is one, it's something that's important, but it's become something that Republicans will insist on. And this is, I don't mean to be partisan in this commentary, but it is more likely that Republicans are willing to support liability protections than Democrats are. Just as a general rule, that divides us, not brings us together. And so it has become a pretty certain demand by Republicans in the Senate that we deal with the issue that you described the Kansas legislature dealing with. It will be easier to do in the Kansas legislature than here, but it becomes a negotiating tactic. And originally, the reason I mentioned McConnell's insistence on liability protection, because at about the same time, he indicated that he was strongly opposed to additional aid to states and local units of government. And I think that's a debatable issue that the debate will occur. But the reason I think that these two things then, that in the leader's mind, this gives us a bargaining chip to get liability protection when the insistence will be more help for particularly local units of government, but states and local units of government. So there's a political, just as an insight of that I think is true, is when we say that when McConnell indicated he's opposed to more money to states and local units of government, that sets up the stage for him to try to get liability reform here, and it will be front and center in any debate about another phase.
Great. So we hear that the scientists are predicting another wave of coronavirus this fall and winter. Is there a committee or group in place to begin planning so that we don't find ourselves in the same situation of not having adequate supplies or PPE and ventilators available? And will anyone name a pandemic task force that will come up with some long-term plans and national guidelines to use stricken again? Yeah.
Well, Ann, thank you for the question. It's a good question. It is, I mean, the reason that it's a good question is because the truth is that the country wasn't well prepared for this circumstance. I think Americans generally would say this kind of thing doesn't happen in our country. It happens elsewhere in a different continent. Kansans probably in particular would say this isn't going to happen here in the middle of the country. It might happen on the coast in the big cities. And so there was a lack of preparedness that needs to be overcome for the future. And I think I don't know which one is an easier question, but from my perspective, looking more long-term, but long-term really is this fall. We need to put ourselves in a position in which we are not dependent upon other countries for personal protection equipment. So we were successful in getting all the equipment that was stored in a strategic storage by the federal government that we could make the case that Kansas was entitled to. We got that delivered to Kansas, and it's being used by the Kansas Department of Health and Environment and the state emergency preparedness folks. Then after we accomplished that, then it became somebody who has ordered PPE, and it's sitting on a dock someplace at the port of Los Angeles. And then that meant we were involved in customs and with the FDA. And what we discovered is that in so many instances, the FDA was unwilling to release what had been ordered. It came from other places, China, elsewhere, because it didn't meet our standards. So it's a reminder that we need to do a much better job of manufacturing within the United States, those things that are critical to our health and well-being. And we need to have a supply chain that utilizes other countries. Taiwan and Japan come to mind, maybe South Korea, that utilize the same standards as the United States. We were successful in getting 100,000 masks donated to Kansas by the Taiwan government. And you didn't have to worry about what their quality was because they have to meet the same standard as we do in the US. So more long-term, but really now, we need to be developing the supply chain to meet our country's needs in this regard. You mentioned ventilators. We've had companies in Kansas and across the country. Spirit Aerosystems in Wichita, our state's largest employer, is now manufacturing in conjunction with another company, ventilators. So we're shifting to things that are important to our country, and we need to make sure we reward that and we encourage that, and we're better prepared. I also would say that my view is, and we've seen some evidence, the first conference call I had when this became evident it was going to be a serious problem in Kansas and across the country was with the county health departments. All 105 of them were invited, and many participated to have a conversation about what's going on at home in the county. And we have underinvested in our county health departments for a long time. Part of that is local dollars, but part of it is federal. The CDC, the Center for Disease Control, provides significant amounts of money and grants to county health departments. But again, I would say that's what we ought to be investing in today. When we talk about another phase, and there are those who say no phase, and there's the House who says we need a $3 trillion phase, I keep thinking of the things that are much more manageable and significant to solve the problem so we don't go through this again. We're waiting. There is efforts to make certain that we are prepared if this returns to the country in the fall. I hope we don't have the naysayers who simply believe that's not possible. And I would say that we are waiting on a couple pieces of information. What is the spread of the virus as people are more out and about, as the stay-at-home orders begin to be altered and disappear? Is distancing still being conducted, and what's the consequence to people being more active? Does the virus spread? The other is the weather. As you indicated, it was a great sunny day. As the summer months arrive, does the warm weather keep the virus from spreading? And then most importantly, the suggestion by Dr. Francis Collins, the head of NIH, that by October or November, we could have a vaccine. I failed to mention that the plan is beginning to manufacture a vaccine that we don't yet know works. But in case it does work, if the test determined that it is the right vaccine, that we're then not waiting months for the manufacturing sector to catch up with us. So the vaccine, more tests, more PPE, all put us in a different place than where we were when we started this problem earlier this year. And remember that the reason that we were told to socially distance, and then the reason that we were told that we needed to stay home, was the lack of tools available for our healthcare providers, the lack of PPE, the lack of tests, the lack of ventilators. And that ought to be something that we are not in. If the virus returns in the fall, surely we will not be in that same position of having to make decisions just to make certain that we don't overwhelm our healthcare providers, our healthcare system, and the people who work there.
Yeah, no, those are great points. Absolutely. Um, just kind of a little bit as a side note, you were talking a little bit about the logistics and supply chain. I mean, we see this as an opportunity. Obviously, we know that one of the biggest assets of Kansas is our location, and being able to quickly get to most of the continental United States within 24 hours. And so we think that working with the Department of Commerce, that we'll see a lot of growth in that sector within Johnson County and presumably the entire state.
And I meant to say that it is an opportunity for a chamber for economic development, for local governments to engage in this concept. I know this won't be offensive to you because I've been to a chamber after hours that occurred in a Shawnee Chamber after hours event that occurred in Lenexa. And we were pleased, did I not? We were pleased that maybe it's the other way. I went to a Lenexa Chamber of Commerce event that occurred in Shawnee. That is exactly what the story is. And the Fisher Thermo Fisher announcement this week of expanding their plant in Johnson County for purposes of manufacturing the medium and the test tube. Thermo Fisher already has a significant presence in the Kansas City area, in Johnson County, and they're adding 300 to 400 new jobs in this arena of making the instruments that are necessary for testing. There's an example of a company that's already here in Kansas expanding, but there's opportunities for us because of location. And you have so many advantages with transportation and intellectual capabilities of workforce technology that make Kansas City, but make the middle part of the country a desired location. It'd be great if we're manufacturing vaccines and drugs and pharmaceuticals, as well as all the equipment, not someplace outside the United States, but here in the US of A, and even better if it can be in Kansas.
I agree. Absolutely. We are ready. Secretary Toland mentioned earlier that in this time period from March 1st to May 15th, last year they'd opened 13 cases or 13 new projects. And in this same time period in 2020, they opened 37. So the activity is out. So I'm wondering, as we start to see this recovery take shape, what do you see the investment in infrastructure? How does that play in helping our economy recover? And do you see, with all of the stimulus being approved already and maybe more to come, will there be an appetite to approve money for infrastructure throughout the country?
And that too is a really, really good question. And it is one that is being debated now and in the future. The president in particular and the Democrats in the House have both indicated they would like to see infrastructure investment as part of a stimulus package to get the economy going. My view is that while I want, as I said earlier, the response to be related to COVID and the consequences of COVID, one of the reasons that I want that is a practical one, which is if this gets beyond that, then the ability that we've had to pass legislation that is almost totally bipartisan. So we passed the CARES Act, phase 3, 96-0 in the Senate. That doesn't happen very often around here. And there are things in the bill that I and others don't like, whether you're a Republican, Democrat, however you fit on the political spectrum. There are things in this bill that I'm sure every member would object to. But we tried to set aside the belief that we would only vote for what we wanted, but we would vote for something that overall we believed was good for the country, even though we could find objections with specific parts of it. And if we get to the point we're dealing with issues that are not a specific response to fixing the problems created by COVID, it becomes difficult for us to keep that bipartisanship going. And I think it's important for the country to see that ever so often, maybe more often than they do. So, but having said that, if there is a consensus that infrastructure would help grow the economy, put more people to work, churn in our economy, the dollars that we spend in roads and bridges and highways and waterworks and airport runways and all the kinds of things, infrastructure related to technology such as broadband deployment. So if we would do that, if we could get the kind of support for that, this would be a really good time to invest in infrastructure. It's something that we know we need to do. And if we're going to spend the money at some point in the future, wouldn't this be the time, advance that spending so that we get the benefit of the boost? I happen to have Chairman Powell in front of the Banking Committee this morning. Some of you may have heard him on 60 Minutes on Sunday evening. He is indicating that additional investment is necessary to get us beyond the economic circumstances we are in. And again, if we could get something that has value, long-lasting value, like infrastructure, it creates some possibilities. So, I mean, I don't know, that probably this is not the way to answer it, but maybe this is something that begins to develop. Again, President Trump has been supportive of this and generally supported by the House Democrat leadership.
That's great to hear. That's great. So one of the industries, and we've had several, obviously, agricultural, aerospace, energy, but also tourism that's been very hard hit in our state and obviously across the country. We had a question submitted asking if you see any expanding or enhancing of the PPP to include destination marketing organizations. I know we talked about that. I think that falls under that 501c6 designation. Chambers of Commerce are also under that designation. I don't know if you see that this next phase expanding to that. And then just some other questions on expanding that PPP to allow for, potentially larger loans, like 8 times the loan amounts, and extending that covered period. So I don't know if you could just talk generally about where you see any support for the travel and tourism industry, and if there's any changes potentially, if there are other phases with who's eligible for the PPP.
This is, I mean, you had a long list, a sufficient list of, no, just a long list of industries, business sectors that were harmed substantially by COVID. And unfortunately, many of them are huge components of the Kansas economy. Agriculture. We've been really focused on the meatpacking industry, trying to make sure the employees who work there are safe and know they're safe, because in the absence of processing beef in Kansas, in the nation, Kansas slaughters and processes about 30% of all the beef in the country. It is a 18,000 employees industry in Kansas, and it has a $10 billion economic boost to our state. It's just an example. Aviation and aerospace. Sometimes in Kansas, we think of Wichita, the air capital of the world, but I can tell you many aerospace and aviation industries in Johnson County as well. And they've been really damaged by the lack of commercial air service, the Boeing and Airbus not manufacturing more planes because their customers, the airlines, are not buying more planes. So we have lots of challenges. Oil and gas is a significant component of the Kansas economy, energy sector, and again, not much help. I would say I wouldn't want to dismiss any of those things. They're front and center for me. The first public office I ever held was as chairman of the Kansas Commission on Travel and Tourism. And I'm really worried about this sector. It's underinvested in. We don't promote it a lot in Kansas. And it faces tremendous challenges in today's world. I've talked to President Trump a bit about this. And one of the things he said, which I think is kind of interesting, and to me, this means restaurants, hotels, it means, just the social life that comes from travel and tourism by our own citizens and by those who come from elsewhere. And one of the president's suggestions was reinstate the tax deduction for entertainment expense. So if you had a business purpose for a meal, as it was when I was a kid, it was deductible. So there's people who are looking at ways to promote, again, people being out and about and getting the economy going. But I worry about the venues. You took this question in a little bit narrow way, but we are involved in efforts to try to support the venues that require a crowd to survive. And that's just probably not possible to have a crowd for a long time. And we're going to lose some things, some of them very historic, if they don't find support in PPP or elsewhere. You narrowed the question a bit, and it is one that is very common anytime I'm dealing with the Chamber of Commerce. I am supportive and working hard to get
Thank you.
501c6s, which most chambers, community chambers of commerce, are a not-for-profit, and they're not a 501c3, they're a 501c6. When we worked closely with the committee and with the Treasury Department and the Small Business Administration when PPP was being developed, and I thought we had an understanding, a commitment, in fact, that PPP program would be available for not-for-profit organizations, just like it would for a for-profit. We wanted to keep those people in business, and many of our not-for-profits wouldn't have the contributions, the charity support that they normally would receive. And so including them in the PPP program, in my view, was very valuable. I think it doesn't necessarily, one of the great things about, I shouldn't call anything great because there were lots of problems with PPP, but one of the things that was attempted to do is really focus PPP on the employees, keeping people on the payroll, even if they couldn't physically be at work, or if they couldn't even work at home because they had COVID, they were taking care of somebody, the children that in their family, and there was no daycare. To keep the relationship between the employer and the employee at the same time, make certain that people had a level of income to keep them solid. And that's the same thing is true if you are a not-for-profit corporation, or I'm going to say it differently, if you work for a not-for-profit. Then finally, I would highlight chambers, Ann, and I told you earlier something, and I said, I'm telling you the truth, it's not even election year. I would say that again. I am very interested in helping chambers achieve enrollment in PPP, because I've seen time and time again, as I have visited communities, community leaders, it is the chamber that is front and center in helping their business community arise from the circumstances we're in right now. There's a lot of chambers who are the provider of information, moral support, financial support sometimes, and we want our chambers to survive. So I've lobbied Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell. We've lobbied the Small Business Committee. Today I lobbied Secretary Mnuchin in the Banking Committee about including not-for-profits and allowing them to utilize other ways to, even if they had more than 500 employees, if they still met the income and revenue, the revenue and asset standard of the PPP program, to allow them into the program. We need our charities alive and well for the well-being of our community. The chamber happens to be one, and a pretty solid one, and we're working to get it included in whatever that next phase looks like.
Appreciate that. We have a few more questions that have been sent in and try and get through those. Dr. Harwood asks, what are your thoughts on giving states more flexibility in using the stimulus funds, specifically allowing the funds to be used to make up for reduced state revenue?
Let me start the conversation, Doctor, by saying something I'm not for. I do not want the citizens of Kansas, the taxpayers of Kansas, to be bailing out, perhaps there's a less pejorative word, providing money to states who have mismanaged their budgets and have been irresponsible in their spending and fiscal policies for a long time. But I am interested in the money that and so I'm interested in trying to help local units of government, states and local units of government. And the first place to start, before we ever decide about anything else, is make the funds that we've made available. $1.25 billion came to Kansas, about $100 million to our two counties, including Johnson, that had populations of 500,000. And in my view, they ought to have the ability to make the decision about how that money is spent, as long as it's spent related to COVID. And by that, what that gets us into is the ability to use it for loss of revenue because of the declining economy, because of the stay-at-home orders. Not filling their budgets from past budgeting or past expenditures, but helping them recover from COVID if they aren't using that money for something they consider a higher priority. Many times it's PPE or testing, more overtime and services by law enforcement and public health. But I'm for more flexibility. Decisions made closer to home are better than decisions made in Washington, D.C.
Sorry about that. My neighbor decided that it would be a good time to start mowing. So I have a question from Tammy Thomas, one of our council members. Do you see school-age children remaining out of the classroom as appropriate in this setting?
My answer is, I hope, this isn't a very solid answer, I suppose. I hope that students are back in classrooms come fall. I'm allied with a couple of senators, including Lamar Alexander, who chairs the Education Committee in the Senate. His goal is to have sufficient testing so that we can get students back. So let me say it this way, so that we can inform parents and school administrators about early summer, what the plan is for fall. His belief is that testing is the way to get us to that point. Education is one of the absolute most important functions of government, certainly at the state and local level. Generally, education is state and local issues, but the federal government has already provided in this CARES package, I should say it differently, the federal taxpayer has provided money to local school districts to help them in the current circumstance. The goal ought to be to do everything to get us in a position in which we are safe for our children to return K through 12 and university education. And I say that I guess there are experts, well, at least a lot more engaged in day-to-day activities related to education certainly than me, who could speak with greater authority. But I cannot imagine that the learning environment for most students is what it is in the classroom as compared to it is at home using technology. And I particularly worry about, I'm familiar with enough Kansas families to know circumstances in which, young students, young kids are at home babysitting their brothers and sisters while their parents are out trying to earn a living and at the same time trying to conduct a class. There just is a lot of challenges, and there's got to be lots of kids who need the love and care of a teacher and a school administrator and a principal and the school cook and the school custodian that wrap themselves around students. So the sooner we can get us back to the classroom, the better. And there are places in Kansas, including the core of our cities and lots of rural places, that the technology, the broadband connectivity is insufficient for it really to work. And lots of families who don't have, regardless of where they live in Kansas, the money and financial resources to have the devices in their homes to educate their kids. And I think at the college level, if we don't get us back to the classroom soon, that the whole nature of higher education changes for the future. And again, I'm not sure that for a sufficient number of students or all students that distance learning is the best method by which we can do a good job of raising our children.
Well, as someone who's educating 2 kids at home, I would agree. Unless, of course, there's classes coming up on Simpsons trivia, in which case my children will be well prepared. Let's see, the next question from Tim Rhodes. The House passed some rules changes for proxy or remote voting. Many committees have been trying to do meetings or hearings via Zoom or Microsoft Teams or whatever. Do you see this becoming a new standard of legislating and allowing our elected officials to be more boots on the ground with their constituents back home?
Tim, that's a good question. Before I get to it, let me say that I know how how the education system is stooping to the bottom of the barrel because I'm now being invited to be the guest speaker at classes across Kansas. That can't be a sign that they're doing all the things that they should be doing to have me come try to teach kids. Tim, I don't know. I think more technology is in the works. The House of Representatives is much more advanced in this regard than, I don't know whether that's the right word. They're moving more quickly than the Senate. There is some opposition in the Senate. It is easier for us to conduct business than the House. There's only 100 of us as compared to 435. But there's a lot of risks, I think, in this process of trying to combat a virus and Congress doing what it's doing right now, risks in travel in particular. But we're slow in the Senate to embrace this. but there is a small group of senators who are actively engaged in trying to change the Senate rules to allow for remote voting. In the best of times, or in better times, I would say that's not a good idea. You talked about being able to connect with your constituents. I return to Kansas every weekend and have since I've been elected, and I work hard at doing that. But I think there's great value, particularly as divided as the country is, as divided as politicians are, for us to have personal relationships, personal contacts and discussion. It is much more difficult to be difficult. It's much more difficult to be difficult to somebody in person than it is on social media or using Zoom or other technologies. So I would see it as less desirable in normal circumstances. That ought not become the norm, but we need to update the way we do things in times of circumstances like we face today.
I agree. What are your thoughts on remote voting? Or I know that as the election starts getting closer and closer, and certainly primaries and different states have handled it in different ways. Do you see that that will be more encouraged in November, or what are your thoughts on?
I smile at this topic because a long time ago I was a state senator and we voted on allowing advanced voting in Kansas. Long time ago, I suppose that's in the early 90s. I voted against it, and it turned out to be one of the most popular things that occurs in Kansas is people voting not just on election day. My opposition was more, I suppose, Norman Rockwellian, which is I have this view of all Americans coming together on election day as a community, as a people, and making decisions about the future of our county or our city or our state or nation. So more perhaps nostalgia than what I should have had in mind. Kansans like voting in advance. They like being able to do so on the day of their choosing. They like, in many instances, getting it out of the way so they don't have to look at the mail or the television or listen to the radio. And so we have, we get quite a few calls from people saying we want to vote by mail. And my understanding of Kansas law is that Kansans, for any or no reason, can choose to vote by mail. Maybe there is a reason, but I've never known somebody who was incapable of voting by mail that wanted to vote by mail. So I think it is important. I want everybody to have the opportunity to vote. I'm not interested in trying to pick sides on issues that, trying to figure out, well, who's going to vote more, or who's going to win an election based upon voter turnout. I want voter turnout and let the voters decide who the elected officials should be.
Right. Senator, I know we're up at the 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock hour, but we have a couple more questions. I didn't know what your schedule is, if you have time. Okay.
I was the tardy one.
Okay, great. The next question is that given that pre-COVID we had record tax collections, what is ahead for budget improvement and debt reduction?
So I've kind of indicated my views about our spending levels. Again, I believe that the federal government spends lots of money, perhaps even worse than that, we borrow lots of money. And we need to get our fiscal house in order, and you can't do that based upon spending $3 trillion in 2 months. But you also can't do that if the economy is not functioning. So the question becomes, is the spending worth it to keep the economy going so that we can bounce back more quickly and generate the economic well-being of Americans, but also the tax revenue of counties, cities, states, and the federal government? My goal here in this issue is to do everything I can. I make certain would sound too promising, but too often when Congress and the president increase the spending levels, that's the starting point for the next year. And when COVID is behind us, my hope is to do everything I can to get us back to a starting point that is not where we left off with COVID spending, but back to where we were before we invested in fighting COVID economically and health-wise. So we've got to go back to levels of spending that are more manageable. While I've not seen much evidence that Congress is very willing to figure out the tax code and the spending levels to get us to a more balanced budget, A growing economy is perhaps the best way to accomplish that with the least amount of difficulty, but it only works if we don't spend everything that every dime that the revenue goes up, we can't end up spending. So I hope that Kansans will hold, Americans will hold their elected officials to their feet to the fire to get us to behave differently. And that will be quite a challenge to see that it happens. I worry about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've heard some criticism out of the Trump administration and from President Trump himself of the World Health Organization and their handling of the COVID-19 crisis. Do you share that same criticism, or what are your thoughts on their handling?
Well, I don't know the facts. I mean, there's a lot of talk about this issue, and I'm interested in knowing what the analysts tell us about the role of WHO, what they did and didn't do. So I want more information, but I would say everything that I read tells me that the WHO response, in conjunction with their, I don't know whether friendship is the right word, their relationship with China, things don't seem right to me. So I want more information, but I'm suspicious that WHO did not perform as it should, and that the Chinese officials were engaged in this effort. Having said that, we need a World Health Organization. And so if it's not WHO, it needs to be something else. And I don't know exactly how you change the horses in the middle of the game, or you change health organizations in the middle of a pandemic. So a lot yet to be known. I am very concerned about the role that China plays in the world and the adversarial nature of China to the United States. And we've got to do a better job of protecting ourselves and our economy and our national defense from China. I'm probably wandering from the question. So but I arrive at this question with suspicion, but I'm willing to make certain that we act appropriately to change the behavior of WHO, or we find a replacement. But it is, as I said earlier, Americans think that, diseases, viruses, infections come someplace outside the United States. China is not our friend, and they are often our adversary, and we need to wise up to their behavior. But we also need to know that we work in a world in which what happens someplace outside the U.S., as we see by the coronavirus, what happens elsewhere can easily happen here, and we need to make certain that we're engaged in a world to keep it from happening. I mean, any place. We can be very altruistic about this. We don't want bad things to happen to people in Africa. But we also can be, it's not selfish, but we can protect ourselves by trying to fight things that happen in Africa from spreading to the United States.
It's a very fair response. I appreciate that. So the final question that we have here in the chat box is, reducing student loan debt is admirable, but is there credit for parents who are actively saving or pay their children's tuition?
That I've never thought about that exactly that way, but it highlights for me the idea that those who, work hard to get through college without debt, whose parents have created savings plans for their kids. Student debt is a huge and damaging issue to the economy and to the people who have the debt. But there is a level of fairness that this question arises that creates for me to think about. I don't know, Alex, maybe you can help me. Do you know of any tax assistance that encourages savings for school purposes?
Pretty much it's the 529s, and they have CARES and some of them, and usually the 529s, they have a federal component. A lot of it's the tax advantages are done at the state level. So in Kansas, you can deduct $3,000 per student per account. There's early withdrawal fees that's on the interest earned. So if you made money, you take it out early, you're penalized. Those are looking at being waived. So kind of looking at that aspect. But and the CARES Act also allowed for employers to increase the amount of money. This is regardless to 529s, but the CARES Act said employers, you can give more money to pay off student debts during this time frame throughout the year and take tax credit for it. So kind of two ways of getting at it.
Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I have one final question for you, but before I do, just want to once again thank you very much for taking the time, your staff for setting this up and asking or answering all of these questions. If there are still questions out there, are we okay to forward those to your staff and see if we can get answers later? That would be
Absolutely.
great.
We'll do everything we can to respond. I might, before we take the last question, let me see if Connor or Alex or James or anybody has any on my staff wants to correct anything I said or make certain that I've not misled anybody in the way I said it.
No, sir. Everything was completely accurate on my end.
Oh, that's what a good answer from a staffer. Connor, you're well trained. Alex, anything?
Connor stole my answer, sir.
Oh, man. They're better politicians than I am by a long shot. Very good. I'm happy to take another question.
Great, great. Well, and I do feel like I need to warn you finally. I know you're going to talk with other chambers, but Shawnee Chamber really is, the best members. So I wish you well and good luck with the other ones. But
it's down. What you're saying is it's downhill from here on out.
Yeah.
All right.
No, I love all those chamber presidents. We are so blessed in Johnson County to have so many smart, caring professionals that are looking out for the business community and just the community in general. I mean, it's know them well, and we should all be very grateful for those individuals in Olathe, Lenexa, all over that are working for all of us. So the final question was that prior to pre-COVID, there were some tensions in the trade policy, and that had an impact on the U.S. economy. So as we shift into the recovery phase, do you see any different policy action happening to help boost our exports?
As I indicated earlier about trying to bring more manufacturing home and the opportunities in Shawnee and Kansas and the country to better meet our needs, I don't want anything that I said there to suggest that we can withdraw from the world economically, and as I said earlier, health-wise, in so many ways. What happens in the rest of around the globe, what happens in the rest of the globe has a consequence here at home. And we earn a living in Kansas by what we export. You look around at manufacturers in the Kansas City region, you look at agriculture, look at airplanes and the things that we do in our state. We make a living by what we sell globally. And we need to get ourselves in a position in which those markets are certain and there's less uncertainty. We need to make sure that we remain a reliable provider of goods and commodities around the globe. Even in services, I said goods, but you think about engineering companies in Kansas City that provide services globally. There's just a lot of opportunities for American ingenuity and innovation, our productivity to earn a living. Sometimes I remember a Kansas wheat farmer telling me a number of years ago that why don't we just forget the rest of the world and take care of ourselves? And I mean, nostalgically, I suppose there's a lot of desire for that. But the result is, just using wheat as an example, an answer to that farmer could have been, well, what 48% of acres of wheat that you plant do you not want to plant next year? Because what we produce in Kansas is sold elsewhere. We produce more than we can consume, and we earn a living by selling the remainder to other people who can use it. And we need to have an active and engaged trade agenda. I chair the committee that appropriates money for a number of things, but one of them is the trade ambassador, USTR. And so we have an ongoing dialogue with our trade representative in support of trying to make certain that we get markets available and we continue to export more over time. So message received, I think, from that question about how important this is.
Well, good. Well, good. Well, I think that concludes. I wish you a great evening and thank you all. You know, I really look forward to working with your team and all of us as we figure out a stronger recovery. And, you know, we are all interconnected, whether it's at the local level or, you know, what you're doing there in Washington, D.C. And we really appreciate your support and your time and look forward just to continuing the dialogue and how we can make Kansas stronger than ever.
And thank you to you and for hosting us, for helping us accomplish this goal of having a conversation with people who are living every day with the circumstances and perhaps experiencing good and bad things that come from governmental responses. So I appreciate the dialogue. I'm very anxious to return to something much closer to normal. While this is a fine way of communicating, I'd rather be on your streets of Shawnee. I'd rather be at one of your chamber receptions.
Mhm.
You all have worked, your chamber receptions after hours are often on Thursdays, and I can sometimes catch a flight on a Thursday, and I know, find out where you're having your chamber after hours, and we're delighted to be able to join you and have conversations with people in person. I'm anxious for those days to return. I want the
Me
freedom
too.
that comes from being out and about, and I want the economy to be back growing strong. So I look forward to working with you and your members to do the right things here in Washington, D.C. I had a Zoom conference with community leaders in Pittsburgh, and one of the leaders was the president of Pittsburgh State University, and he was telling me what his mentor taught him a long time ago. And it was, in times of crisis, tell the truth. In times of crisis, have a plan. And in times of crisis, make certain that you give hope. And you all, Kansans do that all the time. We tell the truth. And I'll try to make sure I role model myself after other Kansans and to the best of my ability, telling the truth, and the best of my ability, trying to have a plan, and the best of my ability, trying to make sure we're hopeful about the future. So thanks for the chance to see all that in Shawnee and in Kansas during this last hour.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yep. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.